Deadpool and Wolverine. Now, right now, it is the second highest grossing movie of this year. So it warrants a place in our At the Movies series. But if you're at all familiar with this, then you know there's a problem. This is a hard R-rated movie. It is extremely violent and very vulgar. In fact, I couldn't even find a trailer that I could play in church. So you're just going to have to imagine it. So Pastor Kong and I, we had a lot of conversations about whether this was appropriate to talk about in church. And obviously we decided yes. Not as a way of saying you should go see it. I'll leave that up to your discretion. But to explore why it's so popular and what messages it's saying. So, yes, Ryan Reynolds is hilarious. It's got incredible fight scenes, costumes, Marvel cameos. It's got all of that. But I don't think that's 100% why it's so successful. So as a film genre, Deadpool and Wolverine is essentially a buddy cop movie. You know the sort. You take two mismatched people, put them together, and hilarity ensues. So Bad Boys, 21 Jump Street, Bridesmaids, and anything with The Rock and Kevin Hart. Those are all examples of buddy cop movies as a genre, whether they're police or not. And yes, so all of these movies have very funny, contrasting personalities, but they also portray very human experiences, tension, personality conflict, and working with someone you don't like. Those are things all of us experience. And yet, they always end with character growth, partnership, and friendship. So one of the reasons why I think buddy cop movies as a genre have maintained success over decades, and Deadpool and Wolverine is just one of them, is that we actually wish what happens with their conflicts can happen with our conflicts. Because we work with people we don't like. We have personality conflicts, maybe even in our own family. We have tensions and disagreements. And I think somewhere deep in us, we love these stories because we wish that the outcome in our life could be like the outcome on the screen. We wish that we could be like them instead of like ourselves. And that's why I believe that we get drawn over and over again to these buddy cop movies. Now, since I can't show a trailer, here is the official spoiler-free description of the movie. Deadpool's peaceful existence comes crashing down when the Time Variance Authority recruits him to help safeguard the multiverse. He soon unites with his would-be pal, Wolverine, to complete the mission and save the world from an existential threat. Now, if you haven't been following with Marvel movies, none of that made any sense to you. That's fine. Just go along with me on this. But see, what makes the pairing of these two, what makes the pairing of Deadpool and Wolverine as far as the Marvel movies go, is that Deadpool has spent the last two movies, this is the third of his movies, he spent the last two movies mercilessly making fun of Wolverine and Ryan Reynolds, the actor who portrays him, over and over again. And it's hilarious. But now Deadpool needs his frenemy to help save the universe. And of course, they succeed. They fight gloriously together. They try to kill each other like every good odd pairing happens. And then they end up saving the universe. Okay. Now, are you wondering how I'm going to connect this to an actual Bible teaching for a Sunday morning? Well, about 2 weeks ago, so was I. But then I remembered, I started thinking about buddy cop movies. So remember my premise, that I believe one of the reasons we like this genre of movie is that we wish we could be them. We wish that our stories ended with partnership and success like these movies always end with. Despite this unusual pairing of two or more people. Well, if you look at Scripture, one of the more unusual pairings is what you heard about in 1 Samuel, is this pairing of David and King Saul. It's one of the most complicated long-term relationships we see in Scriptures. And I think there's some of this story that mirrors some of what we see in buddy cop movies. So I thought it'd be a great time to continue talking about these two. And especially if you were here last week, this is actually part 2. So this is the sequel to last week's sermon, because we start exactly where last week left off, like any good sequel. So to do this, we're going to hit 5 defining points in David and Saul's relationship. It's going to be fairly quick. We're going to cover about 15 years of David's reign, of Saul's reign, and about almost 20 chapters. So we're only going to hit 5 highlighted moments. And through it, we're going to learn 3 things. We're going to learn something about God, we're going to learn something about us, and then some new way to live. So let's begin with the first one. Our story begins in 1 Samuel 16, where we left off last week. And in the previous chapter, what we talked about last week was Saul disobeys God's command, and the prophet Samuel says that God will take the kingdom out of Saul's hand. So the next thing that happens is God commands Samuel, the prophet, to go to this small backwater town called Bethlehem. And if you've ever celebrated Christmas, that might ring a bell. So go to the town of Bethlehem and look for the family of Jesse. So God has chosen a new king out of the family of Jesse from the city of Bethlehem. So Samuel goes. Samuel meets Jesse and 7 of his very good-looking sons. And in that moment, God reminds Samuel of something very important. Scripture says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.'" And when Samuel finally saw the youngest of the sons, the scrawniest of the sons, David, he said, "This is the one." Scripture continues. "So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him," David, "in the presence of his brothers. And from that day, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah." Now, in this same chapter, chapter 16, we learn a couple other things. First, when the Spirit entered David, the Spirit also left Saul. And not only that, but an evil spirit started to torment Saul. Second, is that David was placed as a servant to the king. Originally, it was because he could play an instrument. He could play the lyre, which is this small sort of handheld harp. And he could play the lyre, which helped calm Saul when he was going into these manic fits. The old phrase, music soothes the savage beast. That's actually what was happening in this story. So here's how Scripture says it. "David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, 'Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him.' Whenever the Spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play. Then relief would come to Saul. He would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him." So this is where the friendship began. David was one of King Saul's most trusted, most beloved attendants. So, the third scenario, the third moment. Chapter 17 is the famous story of David and Goliath, okay, where David instantly goes from a 0 to a hero. Now I know like 50% of you are starting to sing that song right now. That's okay. It's at the movie. Sing Disney. Okay? So he goes from zero to hero. He literally becomes a national celebrity overnight. And the crowds even came up with a song. See, we've got our Disney songs. They have their own song. And its lyrics say, Saul had slain thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Needless to say, that does not settle well with King Saul. He is not thrilled with this new top 10 hit. And because this boy was so popular, this started to make Saul insecure. Continues. Saul was very angry. This refrain, this song, displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me, only thousands? What more can he get but the kingdom? From that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. So it went from friendship to suspicion. So the next day, Saul was overtaken by an evil spirit and actually threw a javelin trying to pin David to the wall. David escaped. Okay? David literally went from the king's favorite musician to target practice, all because Saul has been slowly losing his senses. This dear friendship sours quickly, and Saul gets suspicious, erratic, even violent. He even ordered David to be killed. He put a hit out on David. But at every move, David had integrity and success. Verse 29 says this, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. So a friendship has now turned into enemies for the rest of his life. From friends to suspects to enemies. See, so King Saul was now actively pursuing David. Fourth moment that we're going to look at. David flees. He runs. He runs into the desert. And he manages on staying one step ahead of Saul the whole time. And then in chapters 24 and 26, David actually has opportunities, as the video said, to kill Saul, and he spares his life twice. See, David's men told him to kill Saul. In fact, they even said that God was delivering his enemy into his hands, and he should take the opportunity to kill him. They even over-spiritualized the opportunity to kill Saul, and David refused. Both times, at every opportunity. One of them, for instance, was that David and his men were hiding in a cave. Saul comes in to, relieve himself. And it's so dark, David literally creeps up right behind him. And meanwhile, his men are like, kill him, kill him. And all he does is slice a little piece of his coat off. Saul leaves. That very act rips David up so much inside, he immediately exits the cave and walks right up to Saul. And he confesses and apologizes because he acted with such disrespect to his king, knowing that Saul could have killed him on that very moment. But Saul had the most unexpected response. He said, when David finished saying this, confessing and admitting it all, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly." Saul let David go. He had one of those rare moments of being in his senses, in his right mind. And he realized the difference in his behavior and David's behavior. So he lets him go. Later, in another city, David had another chance to kill him, but he didn't. He and some of his men snuck into the city at dark, and they went in full ninja mode. Nobody saw them, and he actually got into Saul's bedchamber, and he could have killed him on the spot, with his men in the background going, kill him, but he didn't. He acted with integrity, despite all of Saul's erratic and murderous, irrational behavior. Now, the last piece I want to talk about is Saul's death. So 1 Samuel ends with Saul dying quite horrifically in battle. And then later, 2 Samuel, which, as the video said, was really just one long book they split into two. Then the next scene is David learning about Saul's death. And David is heartbroken. He is wrecked over the death of his king. This was not celebrating over the death of his enemy. This was heartbroken over the death of his king, God's appointed king. He even writes a beautiful lament, a psalm for Saul and also Saul's son and his best friend, Jonathan. And then after his mourning, David was appointed king. So they went from strangers to friends to enemies to family, but still enemies. David and Saul had a very complex relationship, but through it all, David demonstrates unwavering respect and honor for his king. And I think that's a lesson we all could learn as we think about our enemies in our family, where we might have bad blood, at our workplaces, even amidst our politics. Are we more like Saul? Are we more like David? Now, in the beginning, I promised you that we would learn three things today. Something about God, something about us, and some way to live. So what do we learn about God from this relationship? Well, there was not a moment of this chaos, which, face it, from David's perspective, this was chaos, probably worse than anyone here has ever experienced. But there was not a moment in this chaos where God was not sovereign and faithful. You might believe God is sovereign but distant. Or you might believe that God is faithful and close, but not really sovereign, not really in control of everything. But this story across a couple chapters of the Bible show us that God is consistently faithful and sovereign over all of this. He lifted up and took down kings. He anointed and removed leaders, all according to his divine plan. Despite Saul's attempts to kill David and thwart God's plan, God's will prevailed every time. David eventually does take the throne, showing that human actions like Saul's cannot undo God's plans. God is in control, even when the circumstances that we experience feel chaotic. And that is an important thing to understand about God. That God is in control even when the experiences that we feel are chaotic. How about ourselves? What can we learn about us as human beings from this story? Well, I think we live in a constant tension, a constant push and pull between obedience and self-will. Every one of us, every one of you is living in this tension of obedience and self-will. We struggle between following God's commands and pursuing our desires. Some days we're a little better at pursuing God's plans. Some days we're a little better at pursuing our own desires. See, we are both Saul and David. We like to think we're David, but no, we're both. See, we are jealous and insecure and erratic and threatening, but we are also just and obedient and honoring. The only question is, who are you more of? And who are you becoming? Is the path of your life, is your trajectory moving you toward Saul? Or is your trajectory moving you toward David? Lastly, how can this story help shape one part of our life? What could we learn? What could we do differently understanding the story of Saul and David, this complex relationship? Now, you might expect me to say, have patience and trust in God's timing just like young David. But that's too easy. It's true, but it's way too easy. Now, I'm going to go for something a little harder. Honor authority, even when it's difficult. Speak honorably, act honorably, every time. Honor authority, even when it's difficult. Speak honorably, act honorably, every time. That's really what we see with David. Yes, he had patience, but what he was really challenged to do over and over and over again was speak honorably and act honorably every time. See, despite Saul's attempts to kill him, David consistently respected him as God's anointed king. And by respecting Saul, he was actually respecting and honoring God. That's really where it came out. And so when you are disrespecting somebody, you are actually also disrespecting God. That's how it works. See, David refused to take matters into his own hands. How often do you take matters into your own hands? He demonstrated the importance of honoring authority even when that person in authority is unjust. Even when you feel slighted, when you feel nearly killed by a spear. You speak honorably, you act honorably every time. Not because that person deserves your honor, but because God does. See, you will encounter leaders and authority figures who are difficult, unfair, even unjust. Chances are you already have. That's sort of a part of life. You will encounter these people. But you honor God when you act with integrity. You honor God when you act with respect. And you dishonor him when you retaliate, undermine them, or talk behind their backs. That is something David resisted at every turn. Even when all the spiritual voices around him told him to act dishonorably and take Saul's life, he refused to. This could be your boss, your parents, siblings, or even whoever ends up as president-elect in November. In the family of God, there is no place for vilifying the enemy, acts of retribution, even those small ones we do in our marriages or with our kids, or taking matters into our own hands. There's no place for that. So you honor authority, even when it's difficult. Speak honorably, act honorably, every time. So the story of David and King Saul, it's compelling. It's compelling because we all wish we could be David, but we also know we've been Saul. We wish we could be David, but we also know what's in the dark spots of our heart. We know we are way more Saul than anyone realizes, or even that we'll admit to ourselves. This buddy cop story is inspiring because it shows us how we too can be a person after God's own heart. That's the phrase the scripture uses over and over again about David. And if you know the rest of David's story, you know he sinned pretty egregiously as well. But the biggest difference when we compare David's reign with Saul's reign, they both sinned horribly, but when confronted by a prophet, confronted by the voice of God, David immediately repented. It wrecked his soul when confronted by the voice of God. Saul resisted. He made excuses. He made justifications. He argued back. That's what it means. One was literally described as he was not a man after God's own heart, and one was described he was a man after God's own heart. So you want a little slice of what it means to be a person after God's own heart? When you hear the voice of God convicting you, follow David's example. Honor the authority around you with respect, not because they deserve it, but because you honor and respect God. Join me in prayer.